Aye, kuwe kuwa madue.
Aye, kuwe amadue.
Aye, kuwe kuwa madue.
Aye, kuwe amadue.
Could you please state your name?
Joe Brooks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brooks, for coming in today. And I want to get started. We're just going to some questions. And the first one is, where did you grow up?
Born and raised down the street in Berkeley, California.
Berkeley, California.
August 8th, 1940, Berkeley General Hospital.
Excellent. And what was it like growing up in Berkeley? You talk about just being in the Bay and being in the area.
It's very interesting. When I'm asked that these days, I have to remind people that when I was born and raised and growing up in South Berkeley, it didn't have at all the reputation that it now has as being this progressive liberal bastion of social justice. It was a segregated, white privileged place. There was a Mason-Dixon line, which is now Martin Luther King Drive. It used to be named Grove Street, where you were really putting yourself at risk if you crossed that and went into the white neighborhoods. There was a Republican-led city council, which was Trump-like, as I think back on it. But even then, there was activism in the black community. I grew up in the 40s and 50s as a youngster in Berkeley, seeing black folks, including my own family, my grandparents, my parents, my neighbors, people that I knew, actively engaged in politics and raising their voices about what was wrong in Berkeley and in the United States and what was wrong in general with the conditions of black folks. And so I had an early political education in Berkeley, seeing my parents involved. And I had I was blessed to grow up in a multi-generational household. I lived in a house, a two-story house in South Berkeley with grandparents, parents, and older brothers. It was a house that was large enough where we used to open the extra bedrooms to folks coming up south to visit, where they would have a hard time getting hotel reservations. They would stay with us. So I met many of my relatives over the years from the South on my mother's side. They were from Texas. And so many Texans visited us, and so I was able to see them and exposed to them. So I learned a lot growing up from them about life and living as a black person. So I was, and I must say this, South Berkeley then, I could claim that we had something similar to what was in Greenwood, in the neighborhood in Tulsa. We had a Black Wall Street on Sacramento Street and on Adeline. And in West Oakland, there was a Black Wall Street on 7th Street. So back in the day, we were turning the dollar over 3 or 4 times in the neighborhood. We didn't have to go far outside of the neighborhood to get what we needed and wanted and to make the connections. There were lawyers, doctors, engineers that lived in the same block or around the corner. So that's what it was like growing up in Berkeley.
So you were just mentioning the neighborhood you grew up in. It essentially was segregated, but there was its own Black Wall Street and a lot of examples of black professionals in your neighborhood. What would you say impacted you the most, or who impacted you the most as you were growing up?
Wow, that's a long list. As I described, I mean, imagine having a grandfather, a grandmother, a mother and a father, and 2 older brothers in your house that you could depend upon, who could give you advice, who would mentor you, who would spend time with you, it was just amazing. And my grandfather was a Baptist minister. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the experiences that we had in Berkeley that I experienced was my grandfather being the pastor of the Mount Olive Baptist Church on Martin Luther King. which, by the way, the city took over through eminent domain to create the South Berkeley Library. But that was our church, and that church had a meeting hall, and my grandparents were very political, and that used to be the place where African Americans would be drawn to meetings to talk about what was wrong in Berkeley and to take a stand on various issues, especially education, which was very segregated in Berkeley. Malcolm X School was Lincoln School, where I went to school. And it, by the way, was the school that we lived next door to, and it too, our house then was taken over through eminent domain to expand the schoolyard to Ashby. But we used to live next door to the school. And living next door to the school, I had the experience and the privilege of being a student in kindergarten of the first black teacher that was hired in Berkeley, Ruth Actie. So, I mean, and I kept up with her through my adulthood, and then she passed away, but I'm getting back to the people who had an influence on my life and that I had access to. And of course, growing up, William Byron Rumford, who was an assembly person and who was responsible for the Fair Housing Act here in California. I used to run around with my buddy, his son Randolph, was one of my running buddies, but his family was another huge influence. But there was just so many people, and that was the thing about South Berkeley back in the day, and West Berkeley, where some African Americans lived as well. We took care of each other. We took care of each other. You could go several blocks, and I grew up on Ellis Street. You could go several blocks in either direction, and you would know people whose houses you would pass. And if I was acting up before I got home, I would hear from them through a telephone call to my parents or grandparents. Neighbors were given permission to discipline us if we were out of pocket. That's the kind of neighborhood that we had growing up. And so those had huge influences on my life. And I think shaped me in terms of the confidence and the outlook that I have and the dependence that I know I can have and the interdependence of African Americans and what it can bring forth.
Yeah, it's that close-knit community is able to foster
Yes.
a lot.
And that's what's missing too much today. And I guess we might talk about that a little later.
No, we're certainly going to get to it. And it sounds like you were able to get a lot of lessons, as you mentioned, just from all these different influences. You mentioned your grandfather having the church, and was that also a big part? I was going to ask too, of just kind of like a constant thing, just being in church a lot, or just was your family all religious, or was it just more of your grandfather and that, or?
No, we were all, the entire family were involved. And the church in the black community was a institution that was a hub and a glue for community, not only in Berkeley, but in most places that you could name. It was a refuge. I mean, look at the role that the African American church played in the civil rights movement. It was a place where you could listen, learn, and take action. And that's the kind of focus that my grandfather had in Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. And so it was a place that had a big influence in my life. I still go to church. I'm not in a Baptist church. I'm in an interdenominational church now. But I'm a very spiritual person, and it comes from the upbringing that I had.
That, I think in a lot of ways that can color your experience, especially when you go out to other places, you get to meet new people and things like that.
Exactly. Exactly. And it wore off on me, and it paid off when I did work in the Black Belt South, growing up, organizing and volunteering and working professionally to save African American land across the Black Belt South. I was able to relate to people because I'd had some of the same experiences that they were having.
That makes sense. And having a family that has such a strong political and religious background, as you're saying, it colored a lot of your experience. What are some of the lessons that you remember that really stand out to you that you got based off of, this upbringing? That
you should not think that you can make change by yourself. that it is about relationships, and it's about relationships in the context of finding and being with like-minded folks, and expanding the conversation and relationship to demand change and to act on your interests. And to, I mean, you know, that's basically what the basic lesson, that you can get a lot done through cooperation and trust. And I believe that to this day. In fact, the Brotherhood is an extension for me of what I learned.
And as we talk about that, I mean, you've had so much experience organizing people to do things. When you talk about, I guess, liberation in just kind of a larger sense, and just trying to have that freedom and bring that to other Black folks in other areas of the country and abroad as well, what does liberation mean to you? What does that look like to you?
Well, I'll tell you a little story that is about the history of me coming along. I was a citizen of the Republic of New Africa when I was 28 years old. And the Republic of New Africa was a movement during the Civil Rights era where we didn't think that it was enough and we could trust the government to think that we could have our freedom and independence. Mm-hmm. And that really we needed to draw a line in the sand and talk about reparations and independence, because we didn't trust what the government would do for us. Mm-hmm. And we really thought that having been kidnapped from Africa, brought here, and had the wealth of this country built on our backs, that we demand reparations and independence and, in fact, sovereignty across the Black Belt South. So I was a part of that movement. And my name then was Yusufu Soni Biata, my free name. Joe Brooks, I hate to say, is a slave name, but I am Joe Brooks. We planted the red, black, and green flag in the Mississippi Delta. And I was able to join that effort because of my own upbringing, and that is, there's strength in numbers. There's strength in numbers, and that if you come together with like-minded folks that could have each other's back, there's a lot that you could accomplish. And so I was about that, and we did a lot. And in fact, it also led to me ending up going back to the South professionally for 13 years when I was invited to be the president of the Emergency Land Fund, which was a nonprofit that exists to this day after having merged with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives to save Black-owned land in the Black Belt South. And so, you know, I'm really about and was raised to think about being independent. Black communities ought to be able to be self-sustaining, self-sufficient, depend on one another, turn that dollar over as many times as you can to increase the wealth and position and opportunity for Black folks. And that's what I did by helping African Americans save their land from Mississippi to the Sea Islands and off of South Carolina. And that was quite an experience. And that all came from, I'm convinced, with the orientation and the education that I got growing up, the family that I had and the community that I had in South Berkeley.
Wow. I'm just very curious. Can you talk more about just that experience of actually helping Black folks secure land or keep the land that they may already be in their family? Like, what were some struggles or conflicts that you ran into?
Okay. So, when you have some time, Google Joe Brooks, the Emergency Land Fund. But here's what it basically comes down to. There was never a 40 acres and a mule. Mm-hmm. It was granted, but then snatched away by President Johnson after Lincoln's death. Mm-hmm. The Freedmen's Bureau did not issue any land opportunities to African Americans, but African Americans on their own account after slavery were able to accumulate over 20 million acres of land by 1910. 20 million acres of land. Now understand the symbolism of land in the South. Mm-hmm. That's a source of independence and not having to depend upon white folks. So imagine the reaction of white folks being able to, Black folks being able to be independent and not having to depend on them and asking permission of them to do what they wanted to do with their lives. Mm-hmm. So it was a struggle for African Americans to accumulate the land that they accumulated. And this also meant that the federal government was in cahoots with local whites in terms of the agencies that were supposed to be benefiting all, like the United States Department of Agriculture and the Farmers Home Administration that makes loans to farmers. Blacks were discriminated against, undermined, and when they did get loans, it was $1 short and a day late. So African Americans accumulated land against tremendous odds. This 20 million acres in 1910 has dwindled down to just over 10 million acres or less now because of the undermining of and the viciousness of speculators and developers and discrimination of government agencies, including the land-grant colleges that are supposed to be responsive to rural and agricultural interests of families. All of these things were obstacles that we fought against when I was there for the 13 years. And I do think that there had not been an emergency land fund that I was a part of that merged in 1986 with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, there would be little or no African-American owned rural property today. The other huge problem that we were addressing, imagine this, imagine a family accumulating land like I've described. The principal owner in the family dies without a will. Some of the family members begin to migrate to Chicago and up south to Philadelphia and New York. That means that their property has undivided interest, what they call heirs property, which means that speculators and criminals and thieves, white folks mainly, would identify these folks that had this undivided interest in Chicago, knock on their door and say, for example, I'll give you $1,000 for your interest in your Mississippi property. Not knowing any better, that Chicago resident, that Chicago relative needing $1,000 sells their interest. That developer goes to court in Mississippi and demands that their interests be divided, and therefore the court orders a petition, a public sale of the property so that that individual can get their piece. That public sale, you can imagine, goes to whom? It goes to the highest bidder and not to the black folks that originally owned the land. And so that's been another huge ripoff that we have been fighting against and fight against to this day. There's one other thing that I'd like to add about the value of black land ownership in the rural South, especially during the 60s and 70s and the Civil Rights era. People registering people to vote, people who were threatened with being going to jail. Property owners, landowners were the ones who could provide them with shelter and often would show up to pay their way out of jail. Because land being the value that it is, it's a security base and a source of wealth that allows you to be independent of the system. And so that's another source.
That's a good point. And where did you get the, I guess, resilience to just continuously deal with so many of these issues and as you're dealing with, federal government, as the thieves, as you mentioned earlier, that seems to be really taxing, just have to constantly just kind of go back and forth. And as you mentioned, basically raise enough money to bid on land that was already owned. So how do you get the resilience?
It hasn't been hard, really. I mean, first of all, I was fortunate enough to go to college, get an advanced degree, able to think, learn a lot of things. There was too much in my face not to do something about it. Knowing what you know, how can you relax and have any peace of mind without acting on what you know? That's been a driving force in my life. And I had parents and grandparents that felt the same way and did the same thing. I mean, growing up after church on Sunday, we would have a political discussion eating chicken. Wow. In the house. We were talking about what was wrong and not about what was just wrong. What are we going to do about it? Because that would always be what you going to do about it. And if you know too much not to act.
That's a good way to put it. And just having these conversations and just from your experience, what would you say are maybe the top 3 most harmful things you've seen happen, I guess, in the black community or to the black community?
I think one of the biggest things that tore us apart, believe it or not, is the civil rights legislation.
Really?
Yes, because we then saw the opportunity and thought that the white man's ice water was colder than our own. And the black Wall Streets that we had, we began to go outside of ourselves. We spread ourselves too thin. It led to the opportunity for divide and conquer.
Gotcha.
We forgot about where we came from. We forgot about what was important. And so I've said that, and it shocked a lot of people that I would say that. You know, I don't champion segregation, but I don't also applaud it, and I'm not. I don't think that it has done what it was intended to do, and I think as I think back on it, and when I remember when it happened, I used to be in discussions about what capitalism was doing and not doing for us, which it wasn't doing very much. I've been in my own thinking a democratic socialist for most of my adult life anyway. And so I really thought then that when desegregation happened, I was hoping that we would hang as a community, but I was wrong. Again, there's nothing wrong with it, but it did undermine our cohesiveness that we had going when we started wanting to go to the suburbs. And we weren't liked in the suburbs, but we still thought that their ice water was colder than our own. That's just my metaphor for it.
Oh, understood. No, I get it. No, I definitely, it's a lot there. And what do you think, as you're mentioning this, like you said earlier, you talk with your family, and one of the questions outside of identifying the problem was, what are we going to do about it? And what you were just mentioning from just kind of that divide and conquer tactic that you've seen play out, and just even from those of capitalism and how that's impacted black folks. What would you say is, I guess, maybe a way to fix some of these bigger issues, or ways clearly you've been working on that in terms of the black land ownership and things of that. Is there other things you thought of in terms of fixing and for the community?
Each one teach one. Those of us who know better need to share what we know, and we haven't done that. One of the values that I see in the Brotherhood of Elders Network is that when you begin to think about the talent that we have and the intergenerational connection that represents, we're a gold mine. So how do you use that gold? How do you use that gold? And I think that that's where we are, and that's the excitement that I have with the Brotherhood. But to be more fundamental, you have to begin with where the problem starts, and it begins with education. It begins with education. If we do not organize and pay attention to ourselves around what's happening with education, if we don't show up and have the kind of presence and investment in the education of our kids, and in the education of poor kids especially, and the capacity and the lack of capacity that the parents of poor kids have, and how they have to be surrounded as well, we're going to continue to lose out. It starts there. It starts there. And so just take Oakland, for example. We've got African Americans on the board. Right. They need to be challenged. They need to be educated. They need to be aligned with the interests and what needs to happen in Oakland more generally for the kids in those schools to benefit and to be able to grow and prosper. So it starts there. It starts with education. Then it starts, and then that then expands itself into ownership. We have to begin to own and to see ourselves owning solutions and being accountable for the actions that we take to own. And so I think we're beginning to think about that. It's about wealth building. It's about wealth building, and then it's about leveraging that wealth to create opportunity and institutions for a broader mix of African Americans who've been left behind, who will no longer be left behind. That's my sort of like theory of change. Now, that's not an overnight thing.
Right.
That's a generational, intergenerational challenge. So.
It's definitely something we're still dealing with. And just given that, what would you say to your younger self, just based off of some of the experiences you've had this far? What would you tell your younger self?
If I were my younger self, share what you know. Don't stand alone. Find like-minded folks. Glue yourselves together and spread the word for action and impact.
I get it. That's glad you got it down almost like bullet points right there. That's perfect. Know exactly what's to go from there. No, I like that. And what would be, you mentioned earlier just one of the things you liked about the Brotherhood of Elders Network. I was going to ask, how did you get involved with the Brotherhood of Elders Network?
Well, one of the founders, Arnold Perkins, and I went to high school together.
Oh, cool.
And in fact, we even worked at the San Francisco Foundation several years back. But Arnold called me up. It had just gotten started and said, Brother Joe, I'd like you to come to this Saturday meeting that we've been having once a month. Just some brothers kicking ideas around about what we're going to do with ourselves and how we ought to be sharing information and having an interest in what's happening to these black boys. Makes a lot of sense to me. So I showed up, and I've been there ever since, and that's about 12 or 13 years ago. And what do I think about the impact?
Yes. How's it impacted your life?
It has been in line with what I have been describing, and even magnified it and even made it more important and manageable and achievable in terms of some of the things that I would like to see happen. Just a small example, which is not a small example at all. I never thought that I would have a circle of relationships that I could call family as large as 45 plus black men, some of whom could be my sons, some of whom could be my grandsons. But I actually never imagined that I would have that kind of connection with that many black men, and not only them, but also their families, their wives, their spouses, their partners. So, I mean, what more could you ask for to have that kind of connection? I mean, imagine if you got into some kind of trouble or jam, that you have at least 45 people that you could call on. Yeah. And that you could depend on them doing something if they could, to show up and to be there in one form or another. The other thing is this whole idea of a connection and a gathering of intergenerational black men. I mean, I'm 80 years old, and I'm at a table where I can learn from somebody 25 or 30 years old. That I am ready to listen to what they have to say, and they're more than ready to listen to what I have to say. That's powerful. That's powerful. So imagine that, intergenerational connection. We're ready to go into battle.
I hear that. No, it's definitely, it's good that there is that intergenerational connection. I think a lot of cases that's missing from even some of these mentorship groups and other places where it's maybe one side is willing to give and the other side isn't necessarily listening, or, you know, is discounting it for one reason or another. So it's good that that bond is there. It's been able to be fostered over years. As you mentioned, 12 or 13 years being part of the network.
But you know, there's also an uphill battle with it all. So we've been talking about my journey. So everybody's journey has its own twists and turns and forks in the road. So we're sharing these journeys is a process in and of itself to get everybody, and there's no such thing as getting everybody on the same page. There is such a thing as being on a page and knowing that there's something about that connects you that will allow you to be successful on the road ahead. Yeah. And I think that's where we are.
I hear that. No, and speaking of which, you have mentioned a few examples, but I'm curious, what would you say is some of the biggest struggles that you've had to deal with in your journey, whether it was working with Black land ownership, possibly later on, whether it's doing mentoring? What would you say has stood out to you as like a particularly tough hurdle or struggle in your life that you've had to overcome?
Finding a set of incentives to keep Black people who ought to know better and have it in their interest to act, to have their attention for action over the long term. What are the incentives? What is the frame? What is the argument that will keep us glued together in our own interest to make the kind of change? I mean, you know, imagine a poor person, a homeless person, who you're trying to get their attention to organize, to change their circumstance. You're competing with what they're going to eat next, how they going, what kind of blanket they're going to have that evening to stay warm. I mean, it's big time challenge.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. What is the set of incentives to keep us engaged and glued together to build the kind of strength and power to make the difference that needs to be made? That's big.
Yeah. There's a lot that goes under that umbrella.
Yep.
For sure. And I'm just going to shift gears a little bit. You started to answer this, but I would definitely like to hear more from you. What does being Black in America mean to you?
Well, it's a challenge. We're the other. We're really not seen as belonging. We are definitely a threat to those who have the white privilege and want to sustain it. We're here. There's not a day that goes by that we don't see evidence of that. They don't want us to vote. They're open about it now. I mean, you know, frankly, I've known that since growing up and being educated in a household that was political and experiencing racism myself. So I know that it's here and it's been here. And I have said this often. I am proud of myself in terms of how I have managed my rage and anger. I have been angry for all of my adult life and some of my childhood, quite frankly. When I learned about and experienced that they don't want us here, that they enslaved us, what they did to us, and just think about how we have been educated. For folks just now as African Americans to learn that what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Right. Yeah.
I didn't hear squat about that in school. Not a thing. Or Rosewood in Florida. I mean, isn't that something? Doesn't that tell you something?
Yeah.
These folks have swept it under the rug, and the nerve of them now talking about not outlawing critical race theory to be understood and absorbed, to deny the abuse and that they have rendered on us. That's America. So you talk about being angry. But I have learned how, I think, to manage my anger. I'm glad I haven't had a heart attack or a stroke behind it. But I have been pissed off for at least 60 years, 60 plus years.
Yeah. Rightfully so. Rightfully so. And, you know, I'm certainly glad that you're still here with us. I'm just curious, because there's so much stress that gets put on us, particularly as Black men, just kind of moving and navigating throughout this world. What are some of your ways that you've been able to deal with stress?
Well, fortunately, I have had a very successful 52 years of marriage to a wife that just has exceeded what I thought I could ever deserve or have. And then to have kids and grandkids that I'm so proud of. And then to have an extended family beyond that, that I know and that loves me and that we care about each other. And now to have a circle of Black men in the Brotherhood. I mean, what more do I need? than that to be able to survive these circumstances that I've been describing that have been so negative and impactful in the wrong way on African Americans in this country.
Yeah, that's having a good support system goes a long way. And what would you say, or what would be some wisdom that you would have for a younger generation? You mentioned, grandkids and that. What's some wisdom that you'd like to impart with them?
Pay attention to where you are. Seek out advice, welcome advice, share what you know, find like-minded people. Change what's in your face, but don't go alone. Think about and imagine what could be, and then work backwards to see what it might take to be what could be.
Very good, very good. And wrapping up, but I'm just curious, you had mentioned earlier, I'd like to hear a little bit more about some of the work you did with this San Francisco Foundation. You had mentioned you would work with Bob Perkins before, and you'd had some work there. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a very interesting 8-year experience. The current executive CEO president of the foundation, Fred Blackwell, 25 years ago, I hired him as my program fellow while I was a senior program officer at the San Francisco Foundation. So I was able to mentor someone who ends up coming back 25 years later and being the head of that foundation, which is one of the largest community foundations in the country, and who happens to be the son of Fred Blackwell Sr.
Right. Yes.
So that's a very interesting connection. But while there are two things that I did that I think really were impactful, and one of which goes on to this day. Given my grandfather's influence on me as a Baptist minister, I founded what goes on to this day, 26 years ago now, the Foundation Alliance for Interfaith to Heal Society program at the San Francisco Foundation. It is an ongoing program that makes grants to interfaith groups to affect social change here in the San Francisco region, Bay Area region. I can remember organizing 600 congregations while I was at the San Francisco Foundation to challenge the backward decision on that President Bill Clinton made on so-called welfare reform that disadvantaged people of color. Showing up and protesting that, organizing around affordable housing, dealing with the homelessness crisis. And so I was able to start that at the San Francisco Foundation, and millions of dollars have been granted to congregational interests around the Bay Area to do some of these things over the last 25 years. The other thing that I was able to accomplish against huge odds, but it did make a difference. Foundations back in the day, and even to this day in some ways, are reluctant to fund advocacy and organizing and base building and power building efforts. I thought that to be something that needed to be challenged. I was not satisfied with us being able to make grants, nibbling around the edges of what was wrong. I thought that we should be organizing folks who were ready to take on the systems to change things in a fundamental way, to advocate for policy change and legislative change. And so I was able to organize a group of funders, foundations in the San Francisco area, into a coalition that began to make grants for advocacy and social change. I'd like to say that I had a lot to do starting that at a larger scale, and it's now practiced by many of the foundations in the area today. So that's what that experience was.
Wow. Wow. Now, is there anything else that you'd like to let our audience know, or something that you feel like you would, just like to share before you finish?
I think I've covered it all. I've had a blessed journey on this earth as we know it I have been fortunate to be embraced by family, to have an intact family, an extended family, to have been mentored by many people, to have, by the grace of God, been kept alive, making many very dangerous moves in the South and in other political situations. Blessed to have had the kind of family life and kids and grandkids and reasonable good health, even though I have some health challenges that are going on now, but I'm glad to be 80. So I'm pleased with where I am and happy to be a member of the Brotherhood of Elders.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you coming out and just sharing your stories and just sharing your wisdom with us. We feel it's really important, and the idea of just Sankofa, just being able to give back is super important. So we really appreciate you taking the time out.
It's been my pleasure, and I'm so glad that I feel at ease in sharing this. A few years back, I would have been a little paranoid, thinking that J. Edgar Hoover and his folks were still after me.
Right. Well, you mentioned your health journey and just having some struggles there and things. Has there been anything in terms of maybe a lifestyle change, dietary change, things that you've made in order to, still be able to be successful and walk around and feel good enough to, do interviews and things of that nature?
I'll share that, but let me first share. And I had mentioned earlier the Republic of New Africa and some things that I had done in the South, which, by the way, invited the rage and of the FBI and the Mississippi and Alabama State Police. But in 1971, the summer of '71, I was spending the summer organizing in the Mississippi Delta to get people to sign a reparations and a plebiscite pledge. A plebiscite is a vote that can be taken, and in this case we wanted them to vote to declare themselves independent and citizens of the Republic of New Africa. As I said before, this brought on the rage of the FBI and the state police, and in August of '71, I was there, and then my wife was about to have our first child. My son was going to be born. I had promised her that I would come back to Berkeley before that would happen so that I could be there. And so I left, and my son was born, but if my son had not been born, I would have been in the house in Mississippi where the FBI and the state police decided with a plant inside to raid our headquarters, and we had a shootout.
Oh, wow.
And believe it or not, two of the police, one FBI and one state police person, were killed. None of us were. We were ready and locked and loaded and thought something like this would happen, and we had quite an organized plan. Quite frankly, we had tunnels and ways to escape. But my point is that if my son had not been born, my life would have been totally different, because those of us who survived that firefight went to jail, many for life, and some later had to get out of this country and hijacked planes and went to Cuba. But I would not be alive if it had not been for my son's life. And so my point is that the rest of my life from that point could have been entirely different, and I could have been dead, and I could have been in Parchment Farm or in prison.